Welcome back, everyone. This is Radio Free Market, and I'm your host, Michael McKay, and with me, Dr. Thomas Woods. And Tom, what did Thomas Jefferson and James Madison warn about this? That government was going to continue to grow, and regardless of the other things that we thought might actually inhibit its growth.
Well, they were concerned primarily that if the federal government, as you said before, monopolizes the interpretation of the Constitution and monopolizes the determination of what the scope of its powers are, it's going to keep discovering new powers. I mean, and this would be the case, human nature being what it is, if any person were in a contract with another person, but only he could interpret the terms, well, he would tend to interpret the terms in his own favor, even if he had to stretch the meaning of the clear meaning of the text in order to do so. So that's the main concern. You cannot allow this sort of monopoly. The states need to have their interpretation of the Constitution count for something. The states are the creators of the federal government. The Frankenstein monster does not tell Dr. Frankenstein how to run his laboratory. I mean, he is the creator.
So we can actually expect, without nullification, for the federal government to continue to grow regardless of elections and regardless of this separation of powers of that central authority, which we call the federal government.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And yet it's, if this is the sort of thing that when you hear it, when you hear the argument, you hear the logic of it, it just makes sense. I remember one of the earliest interviews I was doing on this was with a radio host who has been around kind of a while, and I presented this to him, and I thought he's going to think, well, this is just some kind of crazy, I haven't read this in Newsweek or seen it on MSNBC, so am I even allowed to think it? And I presented it to him, and he said, well, makes sense to me. And I think it does, actually. It just makes sense. You hear the logic of it, it makes sense. But yet, so far, now the book has not been out that long, but so far, most of it, with the honorable exception of Judge Napolitano, who's always an honorable exception, he's the Ron Paul of the media. He's the one guy you have to say, well, I hate the media, but there's Judge Napolitano. Other than that, the big radio and TV people won't touch this with a 10-foot pole. No matter how much sense it makes, they won't. And yet, the book is selling robustly, even without the major media that you normally need to get a book to sell robustly. So we're cracking through just on the strength of the argument that Madison and Jefferson made so long ago.
Well, it makes so much sense because, as you say, the central authority cannot put checks on itself. And the real separation of power are the states and the citizens. And that is the basic flaw in the concept of the three branches of government, that they're all basically of the federal government, and that they're all basically connected.
Exactly. But Jefferson said, well, what's to stop the three branches from just ganging up on the people? Well, that's exactly what's happened. I mean, he knew that would happen. He didn't go for all these civics textbook platitudes about how the separation of powers would preserve liberty. Why should they? There's no particular reason. It's the amount of power they have, and that we can only limit, really, by forcing them to stay limited through state nullification.
I want to read another quote from your book, and here it is, folks. Much more important than the feeble restraint of checks and balances is the ability of the states to interpose to prevent the enforcement of unconstitutional laws. This is the real check on federal power. Tom, would you comment on this word, interpose?
Yeah, interpose is the word that Madison preferred to nullification. He used the word interpose. So interpose, the image of that is the state standing in between the federal government and an unconstitutional law on the one hand and the people of the state on the other. Now,
so it
interpose
means to intervene.
Right, exactly, to stand in between as a protector. Now, some people use these words interchangeably, interposition and nullification. I think probably interposition is a broader term, because interposition would include, for example, the lawsuits that states are filing against Obamacare, because that's not nullification. Nullification is, I don't care what your courts say, we're just not doing it. But interposition, it's a form of interposition. It's the states trying to protect their citizens, and the mode of doing it that they've adopted is to go to the courts. So interposition is broader, nullification is more precise, and I think probably is really in the long run the only really effective means of interposition.
So, you just touched on my next question, which are there other options to nullification, like petitions or the courts?
Well, this is what I've included in the documents section of the book, a totally forgotten but extremely persuasive and excellently written pamphlet from a judge named Abel Upshur. And this thing has not been reprinted anywhere since 1835, and you'll be blown away at how persuasive it is. He goes through and lists all the possible modes of resistance, every single one. Everything from signing a petition to violent revolution. He considers every single one, and he shows how nullification is superior to them all because it's effective, because it's peaceful, because of all, and he goes through every single one, and you find yourself just swept up in the current of his argument. So indeed there are alternatives, but they're either too feeble or perhaps in some cases too extreme, and none of them really gets to the bottom of the root of the problem the way nullification does.
Well, one of the problems with the court option is that courts are always overturning other courts' decisions, so there's no relief that the matter may be settled.
Exactly. It could just go on and on and on. And in fact, or conversely, the Supreme Court, let's say, could just refuse to hear the case at all. And then, so then what do? You're just stuck? So the court situation is likely to frustrate you.
Right, exactly. Okay. Well, folks, we're going to be coming up into another break, and I'm going to start talking with Tom more about these, how we got here, the misinterpretation, the misapplication of three things. The General Welfare Clause, the Commerce Clause, and the Necessary and Proper Clause. So please stay with us. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes. This is Michael McKay in Radio Free Market, and I'm having the great pleasure of talking with Dr. Thomas Woods. And our topic today, of course, is nullification, how it can make us stronger. So please stay with us. We'll be back in just a minute. Thank you very much for listening.